I'm delighted to be celebrating Women's Month from Yale Women Chicago Chapter of Yale Women Global. Our art and authors conversation is with the esteemed Wendy Greenhouse, Elizabeth Pinborough, Carol Orange, and myself, Margot McMahon, to hear various ways art has given the clues to writing and authorship. If you want to find and write your own family story from artifacts, art, or grandmother's knitted tea cozy, I'll present my PowerPoint of discovery with Aristotle's three-act story structure. I use this story structure while reading books, watching TV, and movies. With your time in mind, I'll jump right into our presentations. Notes on the bottom show where we are in the three-act story structure. For our February in Chicago conversation, I would like to introduce you to my characters, Mac and Irene, in 1938, as they were falling in love while recognizing their shared passion for flying in planes. Mac's art gave me the clues to find their story. Irene became a travel writer whose articles filled in many blanks. Their conflict was being 18 years old and wanting to fly in planes. At that time, Chicago's steel industry and its municipal airport were taxed to meet the ambitious demands established by President Roosevelt to move individually crafted aircraft to assembly lines with revolutionary order for 50,000 planes. The Munich Agreement had just failed, and Britain and France ordered and financed the first mass production of Boeing 4-engine B-29 planes, already named the Flying Fortress. By Tammy Davis Biddle's account, in less than 12 months of relentless sleepless nights nationwide, with increased strain that required ingenuity of allocation and coordination of false starts, struggles, redesign, failures, tweaking and retraining for every bolt, axle, blade, lug nut, and rivet of plane never seen before. Shortages of rubber for tires, aluminum, steel, and labor was overcome. Shipping by newly built trucks competed with material needed for planes. Mac's senior yearbook drawings indicated they had other concerns than 50,000 additional planes being ordered. Irene was at Francis Parker's College near the Chicago Municipal Airport, which was becoming the nation's refuel and mail stop. Variations of the B-29 became the Stratoliner in the U.S. and the B-17 bomber for the Army Air Force. Irene graduated with an art teacher certification the year Congress cut the education bill and served transporting supplies and materials with United Airlines in the Boeing Stratoliner. Between 1940 and 1942, 300,000 aircraft were made on Ford's mile-long assembly line. Mac, then a cartoonist for a Chicago magazine, became a cartoon war correspondent with the U.S. Navy, where he learned to fly the B-17 adaptation of the Boeing Stratoliner. He flew solo at the Glenview Naval Air Base. It was a rocky landing. In 1943, Mac was stationed in Molesworth, England, with the buildup, flying with the U.S. Army Air Force as a navigator. Mac's Helicopter and Caustic series tells his story as it builds to the midpoint. He navigated 15 bombing missions over Germany in the daylight with flak-filled skies. Each flak explosion shot 1,400 shards of metal at the plane. They took off planes filled with incendiaries. On Mac's 16th mission, and this is the midpoint of our story, a fire started in the wing, an engine went out, and the plane spiraled, keeping any of the crew trapped with centrifugal force. Pilot rose right at the plane, giving them time to bail out. By procedure, Mac was the first to parachute into the coldest winter in Germany's history. Jesus, Mary and Joseph. He counted to 10 before opening his chute. From 3 POW camps, Mac sent out cartoons by V-Mail to the magazine in Chicago. Stalag 3, Stalag 13D, and Wehrmacht 7A were his camps. He also proposed marriage to Irene by mail. So this goes through the storyline that we talked about at the beginning of 3 acts, where we set the characters and the setting and what's going on in history. And then we get to a midpoint crisis, which is the plane collapsing. And then there's kind of a solution of landing and being in POW camp, which was the conclusion of this little story that I'm telling you. So I'd like to pass on the baton now to Elizabeth. That is how I interpreted these works to understand my father's World War II story for the first time.
Thank you so much, Margot. So my inciting incident is slightly different from Margot's, but also is a disaster of a kind. Back in 2015, I experienced a traumatic brain injury, and at the time it was classified as a concussion, and which most people understand to mean, fairly mild, will resolve soon, and those sorts of things. But it didn't, like, it does for so many people. It was not a mild injury. It had widespread ramifications in terms of my physical experience, and also my cognitive and mental and emotional experiences. And it created many disconnections within my own body. And I don't think there's anything that can prepare you for losing brain skills that you have relied upon and developed over the course of your entire life to navigate the world. And, then to be asked to redevelop those as an adult without the contexts in which you originally developed those skills, like being enrolled in college or, playing high school tennis and many of the other things that I did, music lessons, etc. And I wasn't trained in science. I've been a liberal arts person all along the way, with an interest in science, and specifically in neuroscience. But I wasn't trained in neuroanatomy or the latest, science of brain injury recovery. So as a matter of survival, I threw myself wholeheartedly into this, research quest. And it was very difficult, since I had lost the ability to read in the way that I had trained my brain to be able to read, which was from visual injury. Turns out your eyes are very important in reading. So having injured visual skills made reading very difficult. But I was devoted to my recovery process, and, learned so much, and also experienced a lot of loss and grief, loss of sense of self, loss of memories, loss of language, and the ability to find words, or even to count at one point, having a very difficult time doing very basic things. And so poetry is my mode of self-expression, but I also like to dabble in art. And so over time, I began this project of kind of trying to describe my brain injury in visual and poetic form. And it became this book, The Brain's Lectionary, Psalms and Observations. And so healing itself is an art, and you can also use art to heal. And so I worked up to being able to carve illustrations from linoleum and create prints that were emblematic of my healing process. And I used several lenses through which to go through this process. There was a lens of science, a lens of faith, and a lens of poetry and my embodied experience. I think sometimes we're so excited to skip over the dark parts and get to the exciting triumph that we don't necessarily express or necessarily give as much credit to the process that leads us to new places. So this was a book about healing for me. And I learned how to kind of, image my brain in different ways. I relied on scientific imaging to help me get a better picture for what was going on inside my own brain. And I also looked at other images of other brains and just tried to imagine what was going on in addition to all of these, scientific articles and things that I was reading about the brain. And as you can imagine, like trying to understand an injured brain with itself is kind of an absurd project. And so I turned to absurdist poetry, like this piece by Yoko Ono, and really experience the art as well as the science of having an injured brain and working with an injured brain. And so I used ekphrasis, writing and creating based on other pieces of art, including my own medical scans, and to these visual and poetic experiments. And so I took images from life and transformed them into lino cuts, including this X-ray of my spine. And I just find it fascinating that we can see into the human body with such detail and also have it be so opaque in terms of the brain. There are things that allow us to kind of understand the brain to a higher degree. The FDA in 2018 authorized a blood biomarker test to detect concussion, which didn't exist at the time of my injury. But just having an injury validated in that way. Sometimes you can't actually visualize what has happened to the brain if, the CT scan or MRI doesn't show, gross functional or structural problems. That doesn't mean that they're not there. They're just invisible, or, the technology we have isn't adequate to exploring that yet. And it can be very expensive for people to try to track down proof of what has happened and just relax into the validation that, oh, right, there's a physiological injury here. And so I found this, the highest scan done of the human brain, and decided to make some lino cuts about that. And just a hint at what lies beneath the brain. I mean, still so cool, still such a cool image, but still so much we don't know. And so I looked to people like Andy Warhol and his kind of myriad images of the same object. And there was a neuroscientist who I'll get to in a minute who creates images of brain cells, specifically the Purkinje cell, which is on the screen. And I also recreated images done by the historical neuroanatomist, Santiago Ramon y Cajal, and people who have been able to look at the brain under a microscope and just see all of the beauty, the flora and fauna of the brain, and all of these mysterious creatures. And so I was playing on this theme of the invisible with dashes and dots as neurons in the poetry that I composed along with these lino cuts. And I love that this work is, accretive, and it's representative of kind of how our brains grow, I think, and expand and become networked. And so the book is kind of my network of poetry and images that I created through that experience. And I'll just read one of the poems from there to give you an idea of what this has looked like for me. This is the Purkinje ekphrasis, and just saw the Purkinje cell a minute ago. I'll go through these really quickly. This is a neuroanatomist who creates these fantastical images of specifically the Purkinje cell, which lives in the cerebellum. And so I wrote a poem on this theme also. So this is called Purkinje ekphrasis. Dana Simmons Warholizes brain cells. Her neurological art glows neon under the microscope. Purkinje cells edited with color contrast. Psychedelic science, years beyond Ramon E. Cajal's and Camilo Golgi's pre-Nobel, still requires analog attention. Isolate, sell, die, record. Here we are a century later, imaging self, imaging branching organs of sense with skillful hands, micropipettes, fluorescence. Purkinje looks like a little heart leafing from aorta into seaweed fronds. Dr. Simmons pictures the cerebellar forest, notes the pattern of lightning, antlers, and all manner of organic matter, where holons, our roots, are all. Now I know better what the man in Bethsaida meant when he saw trees as men walking. And the end of that stanza alludes to the larger project of the book, which was also seeking reconnection in my relationship with God. I think we don't know enough about how the brain factors into our own spirituality, but I do know that it does, since it affected my relationship with my own spirituality and just my sense of reality in general in the wake of that injury. And reconnecting it has been an intensive and ongoing process. And I'll just end with the thought that we are still in the early days of understanding how properly to rehabilitate the human brain, and that it is kind of an area that needs a lot of development from the healthcare community, and I think is being acknowledged as such recently. A report just came out from one of these organizations that has been dedicated to studying TBI and noting, how much more work needs to be done to create coordinated care and also lasting care, since brain injury isn't one event, but is actually an organic process that can last for years in people. So I'm just grateful to Yale Women for letting me share this story, and so happy to be here with you all.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was fantastic. Beautiful artwork. And thanks for sharing a poem too. Carol, would you like to share your screen and tell us about your mystery?
My novel, A Discerning Eye, was inspired by the real art heist at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston on March 18th, 1990. That is definitely the inciting incident. Isabella Stewart Gardner definitely had a discerning eye. This is the story of an art dealer named Portia Malatesta, who lived in Boston, and she was also a docent at the Gardner Museum. She really loved being an Italian American and intensely disliked the mafia, the Italian mafia, which gave Italians a very bad reputation. However, she was so determined to try to help find the stolen art. There were 13 pieces stolen. And what Portia did, which the FBI never did, she analyzed all of the 13 paintings and came up with an underlying theme. So as part of the process, she met with a mafioso guy named Dino, and she was trying to see if he knew where the paintings were hidden. And she met with him at the St. Paul's Club in Boston. And he wasn't cooperative. So she had to go on and find other ways of trying to deal with this. So what in fact happened is that her analysis of the 13 stolen paintings came up with this theme of the interaction between shadow and light, as you can see in this Sargent painting, which is one of the paintings that, thank goodness, was not stolen from the Isabella Gardner Museum. But it was in all of the stolen paintings. She developed this psychological profile of the thief based on her analysis. And she felt that the tension between shadow and light existed inside him, his psychology, as well as in the paintings that he chose to have stolen. He was the mastermind. And so, he didn't steal all the ones in the Gardner Museum, but the thieves were there for 81 minutes. And the reason that the Sargent was not stolen is because it's huge and it's embedded into the wall. So in the novel, the mastermind, who happens to be from Medellin, Colombia, he was in love with art, and he and his wife went on their honeymoon to Paris, and he was the son-in-law of the leading cocaine dealer in Medellin. And he had gone to the Gardner for someone's graduation at Harvard. And he went to the Gardner and he fell in love with these paintings. I'm giving the whole story away. And his education about art began with Delacroix at the Louvre. So in this painting, which takes up the whole wall and goes from floor to ceiling in the Louvre, you can see the tension between shadow and light, as well as the drama of the subject matter, which is the French Revolution. And Carlos, his name is Carlos Alfonso, he wanted to know if such a revolution could in fact take place in Colombia. But he was very taken with Delacroix's imagery and talent and drama. So this is one of the 13 stolen paintings at the Gardner Museum. It's the concert by Vermeer, and there are only 36 Vermeers in this world. And Isabella Stewart Gardner bought the painting at an auction house in Paris, and she really, Vermeer was not well known at the time, but she was very taken with this particular girl. And so she bought it for $6,000. And, she was in love with, she felt that the girl spoke to her. But the mastermind was interested in this particular painting, not because the Vermeers have become so valuable. There are much more valuable paintings in the Gardner Museum, like Titian's Rape of Europa, for example. But because of the tension between shadow and light, and Vermeer, this is classical Vermeer, the light comes in through the window and it falls on the skirt of the harpsichord player, and it's on the floor, and then the tension, here's the dark. And Portia used to sit in front of this painting with her brother Antonio, and they would analyze why it was such a successful composition, that Vermeer was so intelligent to paint the lute player with his back so that the focus was on the two women and the trio, the fact that there was a trio. Anyway, this is the most precious painting that was stolen, and it really is a tragedy that it's yet to be found. So Botero, Botero was not in the Gardner Museum, but it is discussed in the book because Botero, Ferdinand Botero, is from Medellin, Colombia. And in the novel, Portia meets with an art dealer named Columbine, who is from Medellin. And, you know, they talk about art, and it's through Columbine that she meets Maria, who's the wife of Carlos Alfonso, and it's how she gets to be ultimately invited to the villa. But Botero is so special. Here is Marie Antoinette and Louis the 16th in Medellin. And you can see the humor, how Marie Antoinette is looking at a little frog on her finger. And in Louis' portrait, here's someone from Medellin, an ordinary person, just staring at him through the doorway. But these are the houses of Medellin. So anyway, he's probably the most famous painter from Colombia. So Velazquez Masterpiece, Las Meninas, this Portia and Antonio, her brother, who was a painter, were taken by their father to Madrid when they were in college. And this is when they began analyzing paintings together. This is how Portia started to build her expertise. It was before she went to college and majored in art history. So the story and the mystery of Velazquez Masterpiece is that here is the beautiful, charming little girl, Infanta Maria, and everyone in the world, including Velazquez, is included in the painting. And there certainly here is the tension between dark and light. You see in the corner here, he's the person who overlooks everything in the palace, and he's at the door. Whereas in the mirror are Infanta Maria's parents, the King and Queen of Spain. And also, like Botero, there's a little bit of humor where here's the Mastiff, and this naughty young boy has his foot on the Mastiff. So Velazquez also had a great sense of humor. So these paintings are all discussed in great detail in the novel, because it is Portia's ability to analyze paintings in a very deep way that enabled her to come up with the profile of the masterpiece, of the mastermind. So in the story, lots of people in Boston said, oh, this was a ring of people who came and stole 13 works of art. It wasn't just one painting, or two paintings, it was 13. And she said, no, it's someone had stolen them for personal pleasure. And Portia realized that she was not alone, because Boston swirled with gossip about the robbery. And that's it. Thank you so much, Margot, for asking me to do this.
Cheryl, thank you so much for sharing your story and discovery. It's great. I hope everyone enjoys going to the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston. Soon we'll hear from Wendy Greenhouse, who is a Yale woman, Chicago, and a leading expert in Chicago art. We have such an esteemed group of women here that is remarkable that we're all together for this hour of conversation.
I'm an art historian, and as a scholar of American art, the art is the focus rather than a means to the end. And the creativity for me comes in developing narratives that help us understand, see, and interpret works of art, particularly in their historical contexts. So I start with a work of art. In a lot of the work I've done has been short form interpretive essays for general readers that help them look at the art and see the art in a kind of a bigger way. And I'd like to just give a couple of examples of how I work, what my process is. So I have two works of art that I would like to use to kind of demonstrate my approach to interpreting works of art, which I'm taking as a loose way of interpreting the idea of writing about art. Sometimes it's a written form, sometimes it's in the form of a public presentation or a lecture or a seminar. This is one that I've used in some education work that I've done with the Art Institute of Chicago. And I'm very attached to this painting by Winslow Homer, not only because Winslow Homer is probably my favorite artist if I had to pick a favorite artist, but also because it's a painting that is owned by the Terra Foundation of American Art in Chicago. And when they acquired it, it wasn't terribly well known, and really nobody had really looked at it and interpreted it and really written about it. And that was kind of open for me to do in the work that I was doing with the Terra Foundation. So I think in some ways I'm the originator of the interpretation of this rather modest looking painting, which is from quite early in Homer's career. And this is a great painting in which to experiment with the idea of starting from an object and just working with your innocent eye, knowing nothing about the artist or the circumstances in which an artwork was created, and really just looking directly at what we see and bringing nothing else to it. And it's been a very effective approach working with, in my case, Chicago public school teachers of language arts and history, to give them the tools to use art in the classroom for teaching their subject matter, and overcoming their concerns that because they don't know anything about art, they have nothing to say about a work of art, which could not be further from the truth. So the wonderful thing about the innocent eye is that everybody has the tools for getting something out of a work of art. You don't have to know anything about the art. And in fact, knowing something about American art history and the artist as I do is actually a bit of a handicap for me in looking afresh at works of art and responding to them at a purely emotional or sensual level, which is something we tend to set aside when we get trained in the business of doing art history, which is an unfortunate handicap. So what we have in this relatively simple picture looks like a straightforward image of a country lad sitting on a fence and looking out across a sunny field. You can tell the field is a cultivated field. This is a farm. And in the distance is a line of woods. And it seems like a very simple image of country life, country childhood, nothing much to it, nothing much going on. But you do get the sense that the child is waiting for something. He seems to be looking off toward those distant trees away from us, although his face is shadowed and it's hard to see exactly what the expression on it is. And his hands seem to tightly grasp that slender stick at the top of which is this little strip of red cloth that really shows up against the blue of that sky. He looks like he's waiting. I think anybody would agree that what we see is what we seem to be seeing here. So it's a still moment that is possibly part of a narrative that we can extrapolate to and develop just from this single image. The single image is all the visual artist, the painter, has in which to develop an entire story. So everything needs to be selected to suggest and to guide the emotions and the idea development in the head of the viewer. And Homer does this in a way that's very, very effective by showing things and not showing other things. So what he seems to be showing, some people might have thought, was a little boy waiting with his stick to chase away the crows that are going to come from that distant woods and settle down on the field and eat the grain. And this is something that it seems to fit into the picture. It seems a sort of normal narrative of what a little boy would be doing on a farm, sitting there in the sunshine on a summer day waiting. When this painting was redrawn, it turned into a sketch by Homer, who redesigned the composition with a few changes to the perspective and the proportions. A few years after it was painted, and it was published in a popular magazine in the United States to accompany a poem, and the title of the poem and the title of the image to illustrate the poem was Watching the Crows. And that seems to be the beginning and the end of the story. So that looks like a little bit of context for what's going on, and that seems to be the beginning, the middle, and the end of the narrative. This is a little boy who's been sent to make sure the crows don't eat the corn. End of story. So at this point, we would start developing our narrative by bringing in outside information that cannot be known from just looking at the painting. And that information, if you apply it in an informed and sensitive way, if you have the background to do that, can begin to tell you that what you think you have seen is not exactly what's there in the picture. And that information would be the title, which was assigned by the artist, and the date of the painting. The title On Guard could refer to a little boy waiting to chase the crows away from the field. He could be on guard against the crows. But the date is really, really crucial. 1864, we're almost 4 years into the Civil War. And if you know anything about Homer, you'll know that he started his career as an artist, as an illustrator reporter on the battlefield and in the camps with the Union Army during the Civil War. And his first paintings were Civil War images. It looks like he may have stepped back from that and come home in 1864 for a little vacation and decided to go out and just relax and paint a little boy in a summer field as a way of sort of getting away from the horrors of the war that he would just have witnessed. But in fact, in 1864, an image like this would have been interpreted by Homer's audience to have a lot to do with the Civil War and the developing impact, the impact of it that's developed over several years of combat on civilian life, North and South. There's nothing in this image to identify this boy as being on one side or the other. What we do know about this period is that there was a lot of public attention to the fact that children and women were being left behind on the home front in the war. The men in their lives, the fathers, the grown male guardians and protectors were either off fighting or had been killed or had died as a result of the war. And that pushed women and children into new positions of responsibility. And all of a sudden, this little boy might be doing the work of a man on the farm that is now being run by his mother because his father is absent in the war. The other thing that this information would add to your understanding of the picture is from the title, On Guard. Is he really just on guard against crows or something else? And I think it's possible to speculate that he's been set there as an outpost, as a sentinel, to warn people back somewhere else. It could be the Union Army behind him in camp, or it could be the home front, people on the farm, his family, to warn them of the approach of enemy troops. And so the crows flying up in the background of this painting, from being possibly the thing that he's on guard against, become a warning sign to him that the enemy is on the march. They're coming through those woods, and their progress, their advancing movement has stirred up the birds, and the birds are becoming a warning sign to this boy that the enemy is getting very close. So that all of a sudden this image of innocent country life becomes this ominous meditation on the impact of war on everyday citizens, North and South. The other really useful tool for helping us understand and appreciate these works of art and talk about them and see things in them, in addition to this kind of context of the title, the date, what the artist was doing, is how else the artist or other artists were portraying related subjects. So just a few years after the war, in 1873, Homer had turned fully toward the subject matter of children and women, but especially children in lovely country settings, in a way that was seemingly remote from the war. And this image of the whittling boy, also in the Terra collection from 1873, is a little bit kind of emblematic of what Homer was doing in the 1870s. In some ways, superficially, these are very, very similar boys. The settings are very similar. They're both sitting on these sort of rustic seats and doing little activities. They're solitary figures. In both cases, the individuality of the child is really downplayed, and you can't really see their faces or their expressions due to shadows or hats or whatever, so they become kind of universal figures. The boy who's whittling is not at all aware of anything that's advancing. He's totally absorbed in what he's doing. There's a freedom in his surroundings, in his situation, to focus on what he's doing with that wood and his knife, because he's living in an age of peace and prosperity. And so the rural setting becomes this natural, nurturing, welcoming, comforting kind of a place where a solitary child would be safe, very much in contrast to what Homer has done with that figure of the boy in On Guard in 1864. So that's something of the kind of narrative that I would develop, the way I would write about this work, to start from observations that are just contained within the object, move to information that relates, that's pertinent to the artist, the period, the other related aspects of the artist's career at the time. And then from those things to go to a kind of a synthesis that helps us see a work of art in a completely new way that's added all kinds of layers to what we originally brought to it when we first encountered it with that innocent eye. So that's just an example of my kind of working method and how I use art objects, but ultimately the art object is the focus and the object of what I'm doing when I'm writing about art. I wish I could just spend all my time on Winslow Howard, but I don't get to do that. So I've been in Chicago for several decades now, and the focus of my work has come to be the history of art in Chicago, which is a sort of subterranean subject, because although there is a huge history of art in Chicago, a lot of artists, a lot of wonderful art that was made, very little of it is apparent to most people today, except for a handful of scholars who, like me, worked on it kind of in the dark salt mines. One of the paintings from this history is a rare one that is actually on public view, although I don't think it gets enough notice. It's on public view at the Art Institute of Chicago in the American Galleries, in a gallery that's devoted mostly to the Midwest connection to the arts and crafts movement. And there is this wonderful painting by Alson Skinner Clark called The Coffee House. It is a scene of Chicago. And I should just say that I'm interested in works like this because for many, many years, I've been fascinated by the problem of how Chicago, which was at once described as a horrible, ugly, scary, and totally inartistic place, became an object of fascination for its artists, how they overcome the challenges to making such an ugly modern day place the subject of beautiful works of art, and how that reflects changing attitudes towards Chicago and the struggle of Chicago to imagine itself as a desirable and wonderful place. So Clark's Coffee House is one of the earliest works in the ambitious exhibition wall-worthy medium of oil on canvas that we know about. And it was painted in the winter of 1905, 1906 by this artist who was a Chicago native, but had gone abroad to study in Paris and then had just begun his engagement with urban American subject matter in the couple of years before he painted this work in Watertown, New York, and other places. This was the beginning of his very tentative engagement with the subject of Chicago as the subject of a work of art. And the Coffee House made quite a hit when it was exhibited in 1906. It won a prize, and a few years later, it was given to the museum, either by Clark or by his parents. There's some dispute about the records of that. What we're looking at here is a view of a very prosaic thing, which is a very contemporary bridge across the muddy, dirty, polluted, and stinking in those days Chicago River. This is an image of the same bridge, which had just opened in 1903. It was the fourth or fifth bridge to span the river at State Street. And you can see by this view looking in the opposite direction northward that it was a pretty industrial structure, not very aesthetic or attractive at all. And what I've roughly circled in red there is the bridge tender's house, from which Alson Skinner Clark made his sketches to prepare this painting. The painting is quite naturalistic and factual in the way that it captures the metalwork, the very utilitarian structure of the bridge itself. And it's giving you a view south where you would leave the very industrial banks of the Chicago River, which were filled with structures like the coffee house, which was not a coffee house as we would know it today, but a warehouse for coffee. And within a block or two, you would get into the part of Chicago that was beginning to make Chicagoans proud in the world, which was its famed State Street shopping corridor. The boundary of that was marked by the building that you can see. I don't have my cursor. No, there's a shadowy building in the upper left, which was the Masonic Temple building, which when it was built just a few years before the painting was made, was, so I've been told, the tallest building in the world. And Chicagoans were very proud of their commercial architecture. But in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century, commerce was one thing and culture and art were completely other thing. And to put the two together into a work of art was really a challenging thing to do, and to do it successfully was the mark of being a modern artist at the turn of the 20th century. And Clark was one of those artists who pioneered this subject matter. I just want to try to minimize this a little bit. There we go. Okay. So what we're looking at is from the bridge tender's house, we're looking south, and it's very realistic in capturing not just the utilitarian structure of that bridge, rather an unlovely, inartistic thing, but also a suggestion of the opaque, polluted water of the Chicago River down below with ice flows on it, Chicago winter, notorious as well, and the smoke that was filling the skies over Chicago, this industrial center, and blackening its beautiful commercial architecture. Ever-present smoke was one of the features of Chicago that everybody talked about as being one of the salient characteristics of the city. And for many people, it was a symbol, not as it would be to us of pollution and environmental degradation, but of prosperity and busy commerce and doing what Chicago was known for being famous for doing. By taking the view southward, the artist is not just celebrating the commercial architecture of Chicago and its commercial power, but he's also chosen a moment on a misty-aired winter morning with lots of plumes of smoke filling the air and the sunlight slanting in to blur the realities of all that commercial architecture and make it rather pretty in a way, and also kind of soften our view of everything. So we don't really have to put our noses up against those rather grungy realities that had made Chicago such an unlikely subject for art to begin with. So those are some strategies that artists were using at this time to show us the city as it actually was in a recognizable way. Every Chicagoan would have recognized this scene, the buildings and the bridge and the river, but also to do it in a way that makes it acceptable as an artistic object, that makes it kind of, that aestheticizes it, if you will. On the one hand, this very, at the time, modern way of composing where the bridge is just cut off arbitrarily by the frame, the way it would be in your frame if you were looking through a camera lens, that kind of makes you swoop into the center of this image. On the other hand, focusing the image very, very carefully so that the center is that vanishing point, and then blurring it in these very pretty pastel colors so you don't really have to deal with the realities of it. So there's this fictionalization that happens as a gloss over what seems to be a very, very naturalistic or realistic view. And to appreciate this, we can look at a study for this very painting. This is a study that I believe was actually painted on the spot, whereas the finished painting that you see on the right would have been painted and finished in the artist's studio on a larger canvas than would be easy to carry around in the city. So the painted sketch that we see, the basic composition is there. We don't have those beautiful light effects. There's a lot more snow. And one also, and the figures, of course, are different because the figures are moving faster through the painter's view than he can possibly put down and paint at the time. And one really interesting note here, in the center near the left in the study, there's a bright spot of green on a traffic signal, and it's moved into the hat of a woman crossing the bridge in the finished painting. And that to me is just a little hint of some of the artistic choices that have been made here to focus the eye, to add interest, to add contrast of this bright spot of undiluted color in the midst of all of this rather muted color. That help us appreciate what a fictionalization this entire view is, even though it seems to be so much a slice of actual life. The other difference that we see here are the figures on the bridge, which are very vague and in the distance in the study. And in the finished painting, Clark has decided to really show us more of the detail of those figures, and at least two of them, the woman with the green hat and the woman walking toward us, appear to be genteel ladies in their full going out outfits and their nice hats, the kind of getup that would be de rigueur if you were a genteel lady at the turn of the 20th century. Whenever in this period you see a painting with women who are unaccompanied, you know that it's a signal, a very deliberate statement on the part of the artist to tell you that the place that they are is safe enough for a nice woman to be alone, to be unaccompanied. Cities were notorious for being dangerous, inhospitable places where all kinds of uncivil behavior could be witnessed on the streets, where a place where all kinds of people, lower class people and genteel people, would be mixing with very little control. And that was one of the things that made them so scary and so dangerous, and therefore challenging subjects to paint at the turn of the 20th century. So the view of a woman who is unaccompanied but is obviously genteel, of class, is always a powerful statement on the part of the artist, even if that woman is just part of the detail of a painting like this that gives you this larger view of Chicago. So this is just a sample of the way that I am using works like this now to help develop a larger story in a book that I'm working on very slowly about how Chicago became a subject for artists, the challenges they had to overcome, the artistic means at their disposal for doing that, and how Chicago gradually became something that was not only acceptable as a subject for artists, but also the means of making a statement, on the one hand, about their identification with modern times, and on the other hand, their identification with this city that had originally been seen as so inhospitable to art and culture. And I will stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.
That was fascinating, Wendy. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Really great to see the imagery and what your study of the paintings brings to it. That we have put words to art is a practice in its own. And maybe, Elizabeth, yours is words next to art. I'm not sure if they interpret both, but both are forms of communication that we've found an intersection with in a way of understanding what we're looking at and want to share. I wonder if anyone has anything to say about that.
I'm happy to go. I think, images are an excellent accompaniment when words fail. And I like the idea of getting at a subject matter from a few different angles. And, since I'm not a scientist, my method for kind of conveying what the world looks like is through my eye. And, I think being able to express how each of us is seeing the world is a form of scientific endeavor, in that no one has ever seen the world in the exact way that I see it. And the same is true for everyone else. And so, making that record, both one of, word and image, adds extra dimensions to the communication and helps people connect with it in different ways. Not everyone's going to connect with my poetry. Maybe not everyone will connect with the art, but maybe they'll draw something about that, for conversation for their own, application, and say, oh, I never considered maybe, drawing about this too. I've just been writing about this subject, or vice versa. So I do feel like it's it's necessary, and having this conversation, and being able to look at these different images and paintings and having, words convey the emotion and, provide a bridge to the image is also really important too.
I started off in environmental writing, and very quickly in my career, it became political. If you said global warming, people would say, well, why is it colder? So then we made it climate change. And as soon as it got a title of climate change, it was, well, what does that mean even? Everything changes. It was like every single word that was put on it as a warning that we are warming up the earth because of human behavior was negated right away. And it was negated in a way that journalists felt they needed to give 50% voice to both sides, whereas 99% of the scientists said, this is global warming and it's human caused by our own actions, and we can change our behavior. So I started to make art to express the warning and the concern so that people read what was going on a visceral level through artwork, through carving, through wood, through ways to say, why are so many trees dying, and how cool, we're making art out of them to draw attention to that fact. So that was one thing that I felt worked around the words that became tools against the very message the words were trying to get across.
That's why they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Very powerful.
Does anyone else have any questions for each other?
I have one for Wendy, and it's very specific. I was really intrigued by the green hat and how you tied that in to the fictionalization of the Chicago skyline. And I was wondering if it was Alson Skinner. Is that the artist?
Clark, Alson Skinner Clark, yeah.
Thank you. Had articulated his philosophy for how he was portraying things. Was he, sort of trying to lead people in that direction? Or was he just doing it, through his paint? Was he reflecting on his own process?
Not that I know of. And I think a lot of artists don't want to talk about their art. They want their art to stand, and they're busy just making art and making a living. And, both Homer and to some extent Alson Skinner Clark are pre-modernist artists in the sense that they are not primarily self-consciously painting for self-expression, particularly for Homer. And one of the things that I think is overlooked about Homer, because his work is genius and it seems to stand up on a pedestal by itself and to not be touched by any other artist's work. But the fact is that Homer always painted with an eye to the marketplace. He even chose his subjects, looking at what his contemporaries were making images of, and thinking about what his potential patrons were doing when his potential patrons were escaping the city to camp and rough it in places like the Adirondacks or go deep sea fishing in the Caribbean. Homer went there too and painted images of those things. He was right there when fly fishing took off as a national sport. He was right there when croquet took off right after the Civil War as a sport where men and women could compete together in ways that were okay in terms of middle-class mores. And so he was always thinking about his market. And I don't think Homer, I think if you asked Homer what he was trying to express that was personal, what about himself he was expressing in his art, he would have looked at you very quizzically and not really understood the question. Both of these artists were working artists. They were trying to do a very challenging thing in 19th century America, which was to make a living making art. And they had to make art that would be understood by and acceptable to their audience, or at least, good enough to get juried into the exhibitions and then be noticed by the reviewers, and maybe win a prize to bolster their reputation so they could possibly look for patronage down the road. That was a really hard thing to do. And there are very few, the artists that you can identify from this, what I call pre-modernist period, who really stand out as people who were just totally focused on self-expression. they're few and far between, and often they're people who've been buried in history because they remained obscure because they didn't follow the rules about how to make your art saleable. So we don't know what he thought. I know he was, he was a young artist who went to Paris and trained when that was the thing to do. And he met a lot of international artists who were all beginning to use some of the strategies of Impressionism. They all wanted to be seen as modern artists. They were definitely painters of their time, painting in ways that stylistically may have been pushing the envelope a little bit. But in terms of their subject matter, in terms of how they built a career, submitting their work in certain exhibitions and, being chummy with certain people, reviewers, critics, patrons, gallerists, whatever, they were really just trying to make a success of it. For me, that makes their work all the more powerful because I'm really interested in how these works reflect everybody's feelings about things at the time. And I'm using all of these works of art of Chicago to tell a story that in many ways is much more about Chicago cultural history than it is about art history, strictly speaking. Because I'm really interested in how Chicagoans saw their city, their huge insecurity complex, the second city, the origins of that, and how that impacted the whole business of being an artist in the city, which was considered an extra challenging thing to do. When an artist who was successful and decided to stay in Chicago was a remarkable thing in those days because the successful artists were all supposed to leave, go to New York or go to Europe or a little later to go to places like California or the Southwest. So that's really the story I'm interested in. From that point of view, I'm almost a sort of historian of the social history of art. And I've never been interested in problems to work on or artwork to interpret based on the beauty of the art and how it speaks to me personally. Winslow Homer being the exception. I can do both with him. I'm really interested in the stuff that was created at a time when it was heralded as the great art and then has been buried by posterity. There's this saying, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. I want to reclaim the strangeness of the 1890s and 1900s and look at art that we would never bother looking at now, that we've buried to a great extent, and recreate the world in which those things were kind of top of the heap. It's all, this is a history that's really been buried. And that's one of the things that's always gotten my juices flowing as a scholar. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Well, I don't know if we have no more questions. Shall we wrap it up? Thank you, everybody. This was really fun.
Thank you, Margot, for organizing, and I really enjoyed hearing from Carol and from Elizabeth and from you.